Hello, CBS. I'm going to do this message way different than normal. Neither Cami nor I really could find things to study and bring a message that was going to add to the commentary this week. So instead of doing that, I am actually just going to read the commentary out loud. That'll save you doing that on your own. Obviously, if you want to skip this and just go read the commentary on your own time, that is acceptable as well. So this is page 30 in your book, God's Holiness Brings Justice. As they prepared to move into the Promised Land, the Israelites needed to understand what it meant not just to be God's covenant people, but actually to live as God's covenant people. God had already given them strict laws about living separately from the surrounding culture. Now here in this chapter, we see that he gave them the consequences for breaking those laws. His people were called to be holy because their God is holy. By living according to his holy law, they would reflect him. Number one, God's call for holiness. Israel's new house was not a vacant land. People had lived there for centuries. The Bible refers to these people as by various names, but the most commonly used ones are the Canaanites or the Amorites. Canaan, a son of Noah's son Ham, became the father of the 9 people groups listed in Genesis 10:16 through 18. The largest and most powerful of these groups was the Amorites. Therefore, the people who lived in Canaan are sometimes referred to as the Amorites. Canaan's inhabitants were immoral pagans. Their worship centered on the god Moloch. Smith's Bible Dictionary records that Moloch was a brass idol that had the face of a calf and arms outstretched to receive sacrifices. These outstretched hands were kindled with fire, and human babies were burned on them as sacrifices. No wonder we didn't want to study this. Canaanites also offered child sacrifices when foreign armies threatened their cities. Ancient Egyptian art depicts besieged Canaanites tossing their children from the city walls to placate their gods. They even offered child sacrifices when laying the foundation for houses or cities, a practice that an Israelite later in Israel's history may have perversely initiated. See 1 Kings 16:34. Such sacrifices clearly violated God's value on human life, and God gave Moses a stern warning about adopting this heinous practice. Any one of the people of Israel or of the strangers who sojourn in Israel who gives any of his children to Moloch shall surely be put to death. The people of the land shall stone him with stones. As sickening as the murder of these children was, it was not the only offense involved in child sacrifices. God also detested the idolatry that was part of those sacrifices. God had clearly stated the kinds of offering that were acceptable to him. Any other type of sacrifice made to him or to any other god blatantly violated the prohibitions against idolatry. Such a sacrifice would profane God's sanctuary and holy name. To profane means to treat something sacred as ordinary or with great disrespect. In other words, the blasphemy of child sacrifice would reduce the behavior of God's people to the level of any ordinary pagan cult instead of exalting the Lord as one true God. Israel would not be allowed to ignore such evil when it was practiced within its community. God told Moses, if the people of the land do at all close their eyes to the man when he gives one of his children to Molech, and do not put him to death, then I will set my face against that man and against his clan, and will cut them off from among their people, him and all who follow him. If the community would not take responsibility for punishing the offender, God would deal with it himself. Severe sin required severe punishment. The offender and anyone who refused to stop him were guilty of whoring after Moloch. They committed a form of spiritual prostitution against their holy God and his covenant relationship with them. God was committed to them by covenant, and he had proved his faithfulness repeatedly. He expected them to be faithful too. Any act of pagan worship was adultery against him. Idolatry was not the only danger the Israelites faced. They could also be lured in by the Canaanites' occult practices. According to 20, verse 6, God insisted that the Israelites not be enticed by the secret knowledge claimed by mediums and necromancers. Necromancy is an attempt to consult the dead for advice. Mediums are people who perform necromancy. The person guilty of consulting with a medium would be cut off from among his people. The punishment for a person practicing necromancy was death. This practice of consulting with mediums appealed to those who wanted to know the future. The psychics claimed to have secrets that no one else could know. Such knowledge could be enticing, but God had provided all the knowledge the Israelites needed. He spoke to them through his prophet Moses, and he would continue to speak through other prophets throughout the time of the Old Testament. The Israelites were supposed to listen to these voices, not to the voices of mediums and other pagan spiritualists. The Israelites were to consecrate themselves to God, to distinguish themselves from the surrounding cultures in their new land. Be holy, for I am the Lord your God. By living out his commands, the Israelites would be testifying to the holy character of their God. The 20th chapter of Leviticus begins with a call for Israelite parents to treat their children in a God-honoring way. The attention then turns to how children should honor their parents. This subject would have been familiar territory to the Israelites. Included in the Ten Commandments is the high value God places on respecting parents. Next, we read that he gave the consequence for not following this command. Anyone who curses his father or mother shall surely be put to death. Such cursing would be more than an occasional unkind word directed at one's parents. It probably refers to a more serious act of dishonor and rebellion. The guilty person would have no one to blame for his death but himself. His blood is upon him. God's call for purity. 2. Sexual sin was widespread in Canaanite society, and that topic is what the next commands address. To remain pure and separate from the pagan cultures, the Israelites would have to avoid the common sexual practices of the day. Cult prostitution was rampant in Canaan. Religious literature of that time shows that the Canaan deities were champions of sexual promiscuity and deviance, including incest and bestiality. Although the law codes of other ancient Eastern cultures also outlawed these practices, the Canaanites indulged in them unapologetically. By the time of the Exodus, the Canaanite civilization and religion had become one of the most immoral in history, and they were always ready to share their depravity with others. Israel's laws repeatedly called for high standards of sexual conduct. A casual attitude toward sex would damage relationships between people and with God. God wanted his people to view even their sexual lives as holy. This could not happen outside of the covenant relationship of marriage. Leviticus 20, 10 through 21 records several sexual prohibitions, rules not to deprive the Israelites, but to bless and protect them. The prohibitions began with basic adultery. If a man commits adultery with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. In John 7:53 through 8:11, we read that the scribes and Pharisees confronted Jesus and brought an adulteress to him without also bringing the man she had been found with. Had they been sincere, they would have brought her partner too, for this Leviticus text emphasizes that both were equally guilty and equally subject to punishment. Sexual relationships between relatives are also prohibited. A man was not to have sexual relations with his mother or stepmother, his mother-in-law, his daughter-in-law. The command in 20 verse 14 to burn the offending parties with fire should be understood as burning the corpses after stoning. See Joshua 7:25. A man also was not supposed to have relationships with a male as with a woman, Leviticus 20:13. These were all capital offenses punishable by death. Bestiality, sexual relationships with animals was also forbidden. Any man or woman caught in this sin would be killed, as would the animal. All of these activities were part of Canaanite culture, and all were strictly forbidden for God's consecrated people. Other sins were punishable by being cut off from Israel. Some believe this phrase implies capital punishment. Others think it refers to exile. Without the safety and provision that rested on Israel, exile may indeed have been a kind of death sentence. Siblings who viewed each other's nakedness fell into this category of being cut off in the sight of children of their people. Nakedness here might refer to sexual activity or to voyeurism. Both parties would bear iniquity, meaning they would be held responsible for their actions. A man and woman could also be cut off from their people for having intercourse while the woman was menstruating. If a man had relations with his aunt, their consequence would be barrenness. This was also the punishment for a man who uncovered the brother's nakedness by sleeping with his sister-in-law. All the commands in 10 through 21 are related to God's commandment against adultery. Sexual intimacy is to be shared only between a husband and wife, and these marriage partners are expected to be faithful to one another. The marriage relationship is meant to reflect the relationship God has with his people, as he is faithful to his covenants. He intends the same for human covenants. At its heart, marriage is, after all, a covenant, a pledge of faithfulness, of faithful future behavior, and an exclusive sharing of present joys. Number 3. The case for holy separation. The worst mistake the Israelites could make in their new home was to slide into behavior that made them indistinguishable from their neighbors. I am the Lord your God, who has separated you from the peoples. You shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy, and have separated you from the peoples, that you should be mine. God gave the prohibitions listed in Leviticus 20 for good reasons. These were the Canaanites' customs, and he detested them. The Israelites had lived for 400 years as slaves to Egypt's people and culture. They had not had the opportunity to create their own culture, and God knew how easily they would take on the customs around them when they settled into their new land. He wanted so much more for them. He wanted them to be fully his, not only by covenant, but in day-to-day practice as well. Centuries earlier, God had set apart this land for the Israelites. Here in chapter 20, we see that he was setting apart the Israelites for the land. This setting apart would happen as the people kept his commands. You shall therefore keep all my commands, statutes, and my rules, and do them, that the land where I am bringing you to live may not vomit you out. This was a land flowing with milk and honey, meaning it would not only sustain them, but also bless them with an abundance and enjoyment that a population of former slaves could not even begin to imagine. God wanted them to possess this land for all time, not to be vomited out of it. This strong word describes what was about to happen to the Canaanites. God, repulsed by their centuries of abhorrent behavior, was about to spew them out of the land. He did not want his people to follow in their footsteps. The last main section of this chapter contains not just more instructions, but a metaphor for right living as well. God told Israel to separate clean beasts from unclean ones. He had deemed certain creatures unclean, and the Israelites were supposed to have nothing to do with them. Stated here, after God had repeatedly called them to keep themselves separate as his holy people, we got the sense that he was talking about more than just unclean animals. God wanted the Israelites to reflect his holiness because of what he had done for them and promised to them. Likewise, we who are now God's children should follow the commands of God because of our gratitude for what he has done and the promise of what lies ahead. By doing so, we too reflect his holiness to those around us who do not yet know him. Today, God's people are not united by bloodline or a common homeland. They come from every nation and every culture. Their unity comes from being set apart from this world and being called to lead lives that are clearly distinguishable in faith and action from those that characterize our surrounding cultures. 1 Peter 2, 9 through 10. You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, and now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. If the Israelites wanted to enter and possess the land flowing with milk and honey, Leviticus 20:24, that God had promised, they needed to learn to live in God's ways. Living according to the customs of the nations around them would cause the land to vomit them out. Is God preparing you for some new area of blessing? What might you need to do to get ready for it? Ask God to show you anything in your life that you need to separate from. Then invite him to lead you into whatever good things he has planned for you. I did skip the think about sections in here, so you might want to go back and look at those. But thank you for listening to this and participating in CBS.